So here's a little bit of evidence that the lotteries are random. You'll see that the lotteried in are the green bars and the lotteried out are the pink bars. And they're exactly the same in the percent of them who are poor, the percent of them who are black, and so on. Their previous scores before they came to the charter schools, their math scores or their reading scores. Okay, so they're not any different. The lotteried in and lotteried out are exactly the same. And that's very convenient because it makes the rest of the analysis easy. We find in New York City that charter schools raise student achievement by about 0.12 standard deviations each year. Okay, I know you don't understand what that magnitude is. I'll show you in one moment. That's math. And a smaller amount of about 0.08 standard deviations in reading. So I promise, I will interpret those magnitudes for you. Chicago charter schools raise achievement by about a little bit more, 0.15 standard score points per year in math, and the same in reading. Okay? And just for comparison, what does this, if I were to compare it to other education policies that people talk about a lot, one of the ones that people talk about the most is class size reduction. Well, this is 3 to 5 times the highest, the most optimistic estimated effects of reducing class size by 10%. And that class size reduction effect, by the way, if you reduce class size by 10% and you do it for all of elementary school, you only get a one-time effect. It's not an annual cumulative effect. So these are pretty big estimates. Another way of showing you how big these effects are is to look at a realistic comparison of schools in the United States. So what I've done here is I've shown you, this is real achievement for a typical Harlem public school. Okay? Harlem is the area in New York City where most of the charter schools are located. It's a largely black, largely poor area. You can see that they start off in Harlem with pretty low achievement, and it actually gets lower and lower relative to the national mean as they go from kindergarten through 12th grade. Now, Scarsdale is a very affluent suburb of New York City, as you probably know, or you may have seen it in the movies or something like that. They start off with higher achievement in the beginning than the Harlem students, and their achievement goes up over time between kindergarten and 12th grade. So what do the charter schools do? Well, this line that I'm showing you in the middle, this green line, this is essentially what would happen to a student if instead of going to a Harlem regular public school in kindergarten, he or she started in a charter school in Harlem and just stayed there all the way through 12th grade. And you can see what happens is that by the end of 12th grade, he or she has entirely closed the achievement gap with the student from the very affluent circumstances who's going to the well-renowned Scarsdale public schools. Okay, so that's a big effect because it's entirely closing the achievement gap between kids from very disadvantaged backgrounds and kids from very advantaged backgrounds. And those are the results for New York City, actually, that I'm showing you here. In Chicago, you would more than close the achievement gap. You would, in fact, have closed it by about the 9th or 10th grade. All right, we find the same effect for males and females. You notice I have little blue bars and pink bars. They're just the same. They don't look any different. And brown bars and orange bars for blacks and Hispanics. But we find exactly the same effect. So it's not like charter schools only work for one group of kids. We also find that especially in Chicago, students who start attending charter schools as little kids, charter schools work better for them than if you try and apply in later grades. And this is a general pattern, I think, that the later you apply to charter schools, the more you have to change your behavior as a student, probably the further behind you are, and the more you have to change your mode to operating like those of the charter school students. So it's not surprising that students who enter in kindergarten through 3rd grade end up having better positive effects than those who enter later. Now, not all charter schools have the same effects, and of course this is true, right, because I told you they were quite autonomous in the beginning and that they have different management strategies and styles, and I gave you a sense of the range of their different missions. Well, it's going to turn out that since they differ quite a lot, we can try and learn from those that are more successful and say, which policies do they have versus the policies of the charter schools that are not so successful. Okay, just in New York City, about 20% of the students attend a charter school with an effect that is 3 times the effect I gave you before. So it's huge. I mean, that's the only way to describe it. The first time I found these numbers, I was actually very skeptical. Okay, but I'm not anymore because they keep coming up this way. And about 60% of the students attend a charter school that has an effect that's bigger than the one I showed you before, and then the rest are attending charter schools that either have only a small positive effect or a very slightly negative effect. That's just a small percentage there, like 5%. Okay? So they do have a range of effects. That's important. So which policies are the ones that show up in the schools that have better performance? Well, the most obvious one, the one that stands out, is a long school year, a long school day, and Saturday school. This is the most obvious package of policies that's associated with great performance of charter schools. And if you think about how this changes the life of a student and how this changes the life of a family, you'll realize that it's not surprising that this is a package that might make sense. If you are taking a lot of students from disadvantaged families, possibly a single mom who's struggling to combine work and raising her kids, having a long school year and a long school day, knowing your child is supervised from the beginning to the end of the day, that you can work, that you can succeed with those things, all quite potentially important. And of course, it also gives you more time to make sure that students catch up on their achievement. Constructivist curricula are also usually found in successful charter schools. These are curriculum that essentially don't let 1,000 flowers bloom, but say to children, you're supposed to learn this, okay? That's a constructivist curriculum. And this small rewards, small punishments disciplinary philosophy that I described before also tends to be in charter schools that are more successful. So there are some things that do not necessarily show up in charter schools that are more successful. For instance, the years that the school has been in operation doesn't actually seem to matter that much. Once they adopt the set of policies that work well, that seems to work for them. Okay? And the type of operating agency, whether you're an educational management organization, a charter management organization, or a mom and pop, it's really the policies that matter, not so much what you call yourself, okay, in terms of a management organization. And then there are some policies that we can't learn about because almost all the charter schools have them. For instance, school uniforms. Since they all have school uniforms, you know, the unsuccessful ones and the successful ones have school uniforms. Similarly with routine internal assessments, which they almost all use, and a lack of teachers' unions, which is also very common. The unions are now trying to unionize the most successful charter schools in the United States. In fact, some of the most successful ones in New York City, which are the KIPP schools, and the most successful network of charter schools in Chicago, which is the Chicago International Charter School Network. Okay, so that may change, but right now there are very few teachers' unions in charter schools. Then finally, how do charter schools affect the regular public schools around them? I'm going to skip through this a little bit and not show you all of my slides because I want you to have time for questions, but let me just sort of give you the bottom line and then I'll skip through. We can't know this for every school district in the United States because in many places there aren't very many charter schools to compete with the regular public schools. So we don't know whether the regular public schools do better or worse when they have to compete with charter schools. But in a state like Arizona, where there are a lot of charter schools in a lot of school districts, you will see that the regular public schools are more successful after the charter schools compete with them than before. And that's really what we do. We look at the regular public schools before versus after having to compete, and we see that they're more successful. Another way to try and understand the fact that regular public schools might be more successful when they have to compete with charter schools is to listen to school superintendents themselves. So Joel Klein from New York City, or Arne Duncan, who's just become the Secretary of Education, in Washington, D.C., but was the head of the Chicago Public Schools. Both of them liked charter schools and tried to promote them. And it wasn't because they wanted all the kids to leave their school systems and go to the charter schools. It was because they thought that it helped them be more successful. They thought the charter schools give me leverage over my regular public schools. So that it gives you a sense of what the mechanism is. It's that Arne Duncan can go and say to a Chicago school that's really struggling, look, the charter school next door is doing well with these sorts of students. So you've got to figure out what they're doing well and do it too. Okay? And that's basically, I think, why they have a positive and not a negative effect on average. But the evidence that I would show you is from Arizona, and as I've said, I'm going to just skip right through it. Okay. Wish I could do that faster. Anyway, this is the evidence from Arizona. Basically, this is before they have charter school competition and afterwards, the annual improvement in math, and a similar sort of pattern in reading. They just improve faster after they have charter school competition. All right, so to sum up, charter schools in the United States are different. They're not the same as regular public schools. They serve a very different population of students, and they also use their autonomy to pursue different policies, which is quite important because we think we might be able to learn from some of those policies. They are affecting American education a lot, despite the fact that they don't represent that many students in American education. I told you it's only a few % of students, but they've improved the achievement of particularly disadvantaged Central City students. They have a different management model that now other schools are starting to imitate, to think about, and so on. And eventually, they affect the regular public schools around them, either through imitation or competition.